The auditorium fell silent as John Basilone stepped up to the microphone. 2,000 faces stared back at him from the darkness, waiting for the hero's speech. But as he gripped the podium, his knuckles white against the wood, something was wrong. The Medal of Honor gleamed on his chest, but his eyes were somewhere else entirely. "You want to know about heroes," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for inspiration. What they got instead would haunt them forever, because John Basilone wasn't here to tell them what they wanted to hear. He was here to explain why a man who'd already cheated death once would choose to walk back into hell. And what he said next would make them question everything they thought they knew about heroism, duty, and the price of coming home alive. The year was 1943. And America needed its heroes polished and presentable. The war bonds weren't selling themselves, and the folks back home needed something to believe in. Enter Staff Sergeant John Basilone, the machine gunner from Raritan, New Jersey, who'd held his ground against 3,000 Japanese soldiers on a godforsaken island called Guadalcanal. The brass had pulled him off the front lines, pinned a medal on his chest, and sent him on a tour to sell war bonds and kiss babies, but something was eating him alive from the inside. "They tell you I'm a hero," Basilone continued, his voice carrying across the packed theater. "They tell you I saved Henderson Field. They tell you I killed 38 Japanese soldiers in one night." He paused, and for a moment, the only sound was the gentle hum of the ventilation system. "What they don't tell you is that I failed." The audience stirred uncomfortably. This wasn't going according to script. "I failed because good men died while I lived. I failed because I left them behind." His voice cracked slightly. "And every morning I wake up in a warm bed, eating hot food, sleeping through the night without checking for snipers. I fail them all over again." To understand why John Basilone would eventually refuse to come home alive, you had to understand where he came from. Raritan, New Jersey, 1916, a small industrial town where the smell of the leather tannery mixed with the smoke from the railroad yards, creating a perfume that meant home to the 10 Basilone children crammed into a 2-story house on First Avenue. The house itself was a testament to immigrant determination and maternal ingenuity. Built in the 1890s for a family half their size, it had been stretched and improvised and jury-rigged to accommodate the Basilone brood through a combination of creative carpentry and sheer willpower. The boys slept 3 to a room in beds that Salvatore had built himself from scrap lumber, while the single girl's room had been divided by a curtain that provided the illusion of privacy if not the reality. The kitchen was the heart of the house, dominated by a massive coal stove that Dora Basilone operated with the precision of a ship's engineer. Breakfast for 12 people had to be planned like a military operation, with timing that would have impressed a Marine drill instructor. Oatmeal in the big pot, coffee in the smaller one, bread sliced and toasted in batches over the open flame while she simultaneously packed lunches, ironed shirts, and settled disputes between siblings who were competing for bathroom time. Salvatore Basilone worked 18 hours a day in his tailor shop, bent over his sewing machine, squinting in the dim light as he altered suits for the local businessmen and hemmed pants for the factory workers. His hands were permanently stained with chalk and pinpricks, but they were steady hands, honest hands. He'd arrived from Italy in 1903 with nothing but a needle, thread, and a determination to build something better for his children than the poverty he'd left behind in Naples. The shop itself was a narrow storefront squeezed between Murphy's Tavern and Kowalski's Meat Market, barely wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side. Bolts of fabric were stacked from floor to ceiling, creating narrow pathways that customers had to navigate carefully to avoid knocking over displays. The smell of wool and starch and pressing irons filled the air, mixed with the tobacco smoke from Salvatore's evening pipe and the coffee that he brewed on a hot plate in the back room. But it was more than just a business, it was the family's lifeline. the thread that held their American dream together. Every suit altered meant another week of groceries. Every hem shortened meant another month of rent. Every satisfied customer meant that maybe, just maybe, one of his children would have opportunities that had been denied to him. Dora Basilone ran the household like a small army, somehow managing to feed 10 children on whatever was left after the rent and the grocery bills, stretching every dollar until it screamed for mercy. She could make a pot of pasta feed 12 people by adding more water and prayers, stretch a chicken into 3 meals by utilizing every bone and scrap, turn leftover bread into pudding that tasted like dessert instead of desperation. Her days began at 4:30 in the morning with the lighting of the kitchen stove and ended near midnight when the last child was finally asleep and she could sit for a few precious moments in the parlor, mending clothes by lamplight and planning the next days. Miracles. She spoke 3 languages, Italian to her husband, English to her children, and a hybrid of both when she was angry enough to make the neighbors cross themselves. But more than a housekeeper and cook, Dora was the family's moral compass, the source of the values that would follow her children to the ends of the earth. You didn't steal, not even when you were hungry. You didn't lie, not even when the truth was painful. You protected your family, no matter what it cost you personally. And you never, ever quit when things got hard. You dug in deeper and worked harder until you found a way through. John was the 6th child, born into a family where attention was scarce and privacy was non-existent. You learned early to fight for your place at the dinner table, to speak up or go unheard, to make yourself useful or risk being forgotten in the chaos of too many children and too little space. But even among his siblings, John stood out. While his brothers fought over toys and privileges, John was the mediator, the one who found ways to make peace when tensions boiled over. While his sisters competed for their mother's attention, John was content to help with chores and ask for nothing in return. He had a quiet intensity that marked him as different from birth, a seriousness that seemed too old for his young face. Johnny was always watching, his sister Anna would recall decades later. Even as a little boy, he'd sit in the corner during family arguments and just observe, like he was trying to figure out how to fix whatever was wrong. He felt responsible for everyone else, even when he was too small to do anything about it. The neighborhood around First Avenue was a mixture of immigrant families all pursuing the same dream through different paths. The Irish worked the railroads and the police force. The Poles dominated the steel mills and construction crews. The Germans ran the breweries and bakeries. The Italians, like the Basilones, gravitated toward trades that required skill with their hands, tailoring, carpentry, masonry, anything that let them build something tangible and permanent. It was a world where your reputation mattered more than your bank account, where a man's word was his bond and a family's honor was defended with fists if necessary. Children learned early that their behavior reflected on their parents, their siblings, their entire extended family. Shame was a communal experience, but so was pride. John absorbed these lessons through observation rather than instruction. He watched his father work 16-hour days without complaint, building a business one customer at a time. He watched his mother stretch impossible budgets and still find ways to help neighbors who had even less. He watched his older siblings take jobs to help support the younger ones, sacrificing their own dreams for the family's survival. And somewhere in that process, he developed the quiet conviction that would define the rest of his life, that some things were more important than personal comfort, personal safety, personal desires. Family came first. Duty came first. The good of others came before your own. School was a struggle for John, not because he lacked intelligence but because he lacked time. Between helping in his father's shop, watching his younger siblings, and working whatever odd jobs he could find to contribute to the family income, homework was a luxury he couldn't afford. He learned to read and write and do basic arithmetic, But his real education came from the streets and the workshop and the constant observation of how people survived when survival required everything they had to give. The Depression hit the Basilone family like a sledgehammer swung by an angry giant. By 1932, half the businesses in Raritan had closed their doors forever, and the other half were hanging on by threads so thin they were invisible to the naked eye. Salvatore's tailor shop couldn't compete with the factory-made clothes that were flooding the market at prices no custom tailor could match. The wealthy customers who'd once ordered hand-tailored suits were counting pennies. The working-class customers who'd brought in alterations were out of work entirely. Some days, Salvatore would sit in his empty shop from dawn to dusk without a single customer walking through the door. The bolt of fabric that had once represented opportunity now stood like silent sentries guarding a dying dream. The railroad jobs that had sustained Raritan for generations began disappearing as companies consolidated routes and cut costs anywhere they could find them. Men who'd worked the same job for 20 years found themselves standing in unemployment lines, trying to figure out how to tell their wives and children that the world had changed while they weren't looking. By 1934, the Basilones were living on soup bones and prayers, stretching every penny until it disintegrated between their fingers. Breakfast was often just coffee and bread. Lunch was whatever leftovers could be found from the previous day's minimal dinner. Dinner was creativity, pasta with whatever vegetables could be scrounged from sympathetic neighbors, soup made from bones begged from the butcher, bread stretched with water to make it fill more stomachs. The children's shoes had holes that were covered with cardboard. Their clothes were patched until the patches had patches. Books for school became a luxury they couldn't afford, forcing the children to share single copies among multiple siblings and hope their teachers would understand. But worse than the physical deprivation was the psychological weight of watching their parents struggle. Salvatore aged 10 years in two, his hands developing a tremor that made precision work increasingly difficult. Dora lost weight she couldn't spare, her face becoming gaunt as she ensured her children ate before she did. That's when 18-year-old John made his first life-altering decision. Instead of watching his family slowly starve, instead of waiting for conditions to improve, instead of hoping for a miracle that might never come, he walked down to the local army recruiting station and enlisted for 3 years. The signing bonus, $50 that might as well have been $50,000, would feed his siblings for months. His military pay, $21 a month, could help keep the family afloat while his father rebuilt his business. It wasn't charity, it was investment in the people who'd given him everything he had. He didn't tell us he was thinking about it, Anna remembered. He just came home one day with papers in his hand and said he'd be leaving for boot camp in 2 weeks. Mom cried for 3 days straight. Dad just nodded and said, "You're doing what you have to do, son." But for John, there was no other choice. The family that had raised him, protected him, taught him everything that mattered about right and wrong. They needed him to step up. And stepping up meant leaving everything familiar behind for an uncertain future in olive drab. The night before he left for boot camp, John sat on the front porch with his father, sharing one of Salvatore's rare cigars and talking about everything except the fact that they might not see each other for 3 years. "Take care of yourself, Johnny," the old man said finally, his voice thick with the accent that 30 years in America hadn't entirely erased. "But remember, you're still a Basilone. That means something. Don't let them make you forget who you are." "I won't, Pop," John replied. "I promise." It was a promise that would follow him halfway around the world and back again, through boot camp and jungle warfare and war bond tours and finally to a beach in the Pacific where promises and lives would both come to an end. The Army sent Basilone to Fort Slocum in New York for basic training, where drill sergeants with faces like granite and voices like artillery pieces transformed him from a tailor's son into a United States soldier. The process was brutal. designed to strip away civilian identity and rebuild recruits as interchangeable parts in the military machine, but John Basilone wasn't easily broken or reshaped. The discipline came naturally to someone who'd grown up managing younger siblings and working in his father's shop where precision and reliability were matters of survival. The physical training was challenging but not impossible for someone who'd spent his teenage years loading trucks and hauling fabric bolts. More importantly, he discovered that the leadership skills he developed in his chaotic household translated surprisingly well to military life. He could see what needed to be done, organize people to do it, and take responsibility for the results. His drill sergeants noticed, recommending him for advanced training and eventually overseas assignment. After basic training, the Army sent Basilone to the Philippines, where he served with the 31st Infantry Regiment in the sultry heat of Luzon Island. For 3 years, he learned the basics of soldiering in a tropical environment that would prove invaluable later in his career. He learned how to maintain weapons in humidity that could rust steel overnight, how to move through jungle terrain where every step might be your last, how to survive on minimal rations when supply lines broke down or were cut by enemy action. The Philippines in the late 1930s were a far different place from the war-torn islands they would become. American forces were there primarily as a stabilizing presence and training cadre for the Filipino Army, which was preparing for eventual independence from American colonial rule. The duty was largely routine, training exercises, garrison duty, patrol work that rarely involved actual combat. But for John Basilone, those 3 years were a graduate education in leadership and military professionalism. He learned how to train soldiers, how to maintain equipment in harsh conditions, how to keep morale up during long periods of boredom punctuated by brief moments of excitement. He learned the difference between being in charge and being a leader, between giving orders and earning respect. More importantly, he learned about himself. Away from the crowded chaos of the Basilone household, he discovered that he genuinely enjoyed military life, the clear chain of command, the defined objectives, the sense of brotherhood that developed among men who depended on each other for their survival. For the first time in his life, he was part of something larger than his family, something with a mission that extended beyond day-to-day survival. The tropical environment taught him lessons that would prove crucial later in his career. He learned to recognize the signs of heat exhaustion and malaria, how to purify water from questionable sources, how to navigate through dense jungle using compass and intuition when maps proved unreliable. He learned which insects were merely annoying and which ones carried diseases that could kill you slowly and painfully. Most importantly, he learned how to lead men who were far from home, scared, homesick, and often dealing with conditions they'd never imagined when they'd enlisted. He learned that leadership wasn't about shouting orders or asserting authority. It was about taking care of your people, making sure they had what they needed to do their jobs, and being willing to share their hardships and dangers. The Army recognized something in the quiet Italian kid from New Jersey, a natural ability to inspire confidence in others, to make hard decisions under pressure, to put the mission and his men ahead of his own interests. By the time his enlistment was up in 1937, he'd been promoted to corporal and offered re-enlistment with the promise of sergeant stripes and choice assignments. But John Basilone had seen enough of military life for a while. The regular pay had kept his family afloat during the worst years of the Depression, but now his father's business was recovering and his younger siblings were old enough to work. The family no longer needed his financial support as desperately as they had when he'd first enlisted. More importantly, he wanted to come home, to see his family, to try building a civilian life now that he was old enough and experienced enough to know what he wanted. The boy who'd left Raritan in 1934 had returned as a man, confident in his abilities and ready to take on adult responsibilities. He took his discharge and returned to Raritan, where he found work as a truck driver for a construction company. The job paid well enough to support himself and still help his family, and it allowed him to be home every night instead of sleeping in barracks thousands of miles away. For a while, it seemed like he was successfully making the transition back to civilian life, but something had changed during those 3 years in the Philippines. The structure, the sense of purpose, the brotherhood of military life, he missed it more than he'd expected. Civilian life felt soft, aimless, like he was sleepwalking through his days without any larger mission to guide him. The work itself was satisfying enough. Driving heavy trucks through New Jersey traffic required skill and attention to detail, but it lacked the sense of importance that military service had provided. He was making money, helping his family, living a respectable life, but he wasn't making a difference in anything larger than his immediate circumstances. His co-workers were good men, honest working-class guys who took pride in their jobs and supported their families. But they hadn't experienced the kind of brotherhood that develops among soldiers who depend on each other for survival. They hadn't felt the satisfaction of accomplishing missions that served purposes beyond personal profit. During breaks, while his co-workers talked about sports and politics and family problems, John found himself thinking about the Philippines, about the men he'd served with, about the sense of purpose that had made even routine duties feel important. He missed the clarity of military objectives, the straightforward nature of military problems, the way that hard work and dedication were rewarded with increased responsibility and trust. He tried dating, going to social events, building relationships with women who might have become wives and mothers to his children. But every conversation felt superficial compared to the discussions he'd had with fellow soldiers about life and death and the meaning of service. Every social obligation felt trivial compared to the responsibilities he'd carried as a corporal in the U.S. Army. His family worried about him, recognizing the restlessness that he tried to hide. His mother urged him to settle down, find a nice Italian girl, start a family of his own. His father offered to teach him the tailoring trade, to eventually take over the shop that was finally recovering from the Depression. But John Basilone had found his calling, even if he hadn't fully admitted it to himself. The military wasn't just a job for him, it was a vocation, a way of life that aligned with his deepest values about service, duty, and sacrifice for something larger than himself. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, John Basilone knew exactly what he had to do. He didn't agonize over the decision or spend sleepless nights weighing the pros and cons. The moment he heard about the attack, he knew he was going back into military service, and this time it wouldn't be temporary. But this time, he didn't choose the Army. He walked into the Marine Corps recruiting station in Baltimore and enlisted for the duration of the war, however long that might be. When the recruiting sergeant asked why he'd switched services, especially given his previous Army experience, he gave an answer that would define the rest of his short life: the Marines go where the fighting is hardest. The Marines in 1942 were a different organization from the Army that Basilone had known in the Philippines. They were smaller, more elite, with a culture that emphasized individual initiative and aggressive action. Where the Army was a massive organization designed to fight large-scale conventional wars, the Marines were specialists in amphibious assault and close combat under the most difficult conditions. Marine boot camp at Parris Island was legendary for its brutality, designed to break down recruits completely before rebuilding them as Marines. But John Basilone was already a soldier, already accustomed to military discipline and routine. What he learned at Parris Island wasn't how to be a military man, he already knew that. What he learned was how to be a Marine, with all the pride and tradition and fierce loyalty that the title implied. The drill instructors recognized his prior military experience and his natural leadership abilities. They pushed him harder than the teenage recruits, expecting more from someone who already understood military basics. But they also relied on him to help train the younger Marines, to pass on the practical knowledge he'd gained during his Army service. After boot camp, Basilone was assigned to the 7th Marine Regiment and sent to advanced training in machine gun operations. The weapon would become his specialty, his trademark, the tool that would make him famous and ultimately lead to his death. But in 1942, it was simply another military skill to be mastered, another way to serve his country in its time of need. The machine gun was a complex weapon system that required not just individual skill but team coordination. The gunner had to be able to lay down accurate, sustained fire while managing the weapon's tendency to overheat and jam. The assistant gunner had to keep the weapon supplied with ammunition, help carry spare parts and equipment, and be ready to take over if the primary gunner was killed or wounded. But more than technical expertise, machine gun operations required tactical understanding. You had to know when to fire and when to hold your fire, when to change positions and when to stay put, how to coordinate with other weapons and units to maximize your effectiveness while minimizing your vulnerability. John Basilone mastered all of it: the technical aspects, the tactical applications, the leadership responsibilities that came with operating a crew-served weapon. His instructors noted his exceptional ability to maintain accurate fire under pressure, his skill at quickly clearing jams and malfunctions, his natural instinct for positioning his weapon to maximum tactical advantage. But what really set him apart was his ability to work with his crew under the most stressful conditions. A machine gun crew was only as good as its weakest member, and Basilone had a gift for bringing out the best in the men who worked with him. He could train inexperienced Marines quickly and effectively, building the kind of trust and coordination that meant the difference between life and death in combat. By early 1942, it was clear that the war in the Pacific would be unlike anything American forces had previously experienced. The Japanese had conquered vast territories across the Pacific, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, and they were showing no signs of slowing down. American strategy called for a series of amphibious assaults to retake key islands, but everyone knew the cost would be enormous. The Marines were training for operations that had never been attempted before on such a scale, landing on heavily defended beaches, fighting their way across hostile terrain, and holding territory against counterattacks by fanatical defenders who preferred death to surrender. It would require new tactics, new equipment, and most importantly, new kinds of courage from the men who would have to execute these impossible missions. 6 months earlier, Basilone had been just another Marine on just another transport ship, but the destination turned out to be anything but routine. The Solomon Islands were a chain of volcanic peaks and coral atolls scattered across thousands of miles of the Pacific, most of them unknown to American forces until Japanese expansion made them strategically crucial. Guadalcanal wasn't supposed to be a turning point in the war. It was supposed to be a footnote, another stepping stone in America's island-hopping campaign toward Japan. Intelligence reports suggested light Japanese resistance, maybe a few hundred construction workers building an airfield. The Marines expected to land, secure the airfield, and move on to the next target within a few weeks, but the Japanese had other plans, and their plans involved turning Guadalcanal into a killing ground where American expansion in the Pacific would be stopped permanently. The island itself was a green hell unlike anything most Americans had ever imagined. 100 miles long and 30 miles wide, it was covered in triple canopy jungle so dense that entire battalions could march within yards of each other without making contact. The heat was crushing, a wet, oppressive blanket that sapped strength and rotted equipment within days of exposure. Rain fell almost constantly, not the gentle showers that Americans knew but torrential downpours that turned every stream into a raging river and every footpath into a mudslide. The jungle floor was a soggy carpet of rotting vegetation that released clouds of insects and disease with every step. Marines lost 20 pounds in their first month on the island, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had been muscular when they'd left the States. The wildlife was as hostile as the terrain. Crocodiles lurked in every river and stream. Snakes dropped from trees without warning, some of them venomous enough to kill a man in minutes. Spiders the size of dinner plates spun webs across jungle paths, and their bites could cause infections that refused to heal in the tropical humidity. But worse than the natural dangers were the man-made ones. The Japanese had been fortifying Guadalcanal for months, building bunkers and defensive positions with the kind of methodical precision that characterized everything they did. They'd studied the terrain, identified the most likely landing beaches, and prepared killing fields that would turn any assault into a slaughter. More importantly, they'd learned to use the jungle itself as a weapon. Japanese soldiers could move through terrain that stopped American patrols completely, appearing and disappearing like ghosts in the green darkness. They knew every trail, every river crossing, every ridge that offered a tactical advantage, but worse than the physical conditions were the psychological ones. The Japanese didn't just attack, they tormented their enemies with psychological warfare designed to break morale before the shooting started. They would infiltrate Marine positions at night, not to attack, but to whisper in broken English about the Marines' families back home, about how they were going to die far from everything they loved. They would leave mutilated bodies of captured Marines in places where patrols would find them, arranged in grotesque positions designed to terrorize rather than simply kill. They would mimic the sounds of wounded Marines calling for help, drawing rescuers into carefully prepared ambushes. Most unsettling of all were the night attacks that never came, hours of Japanese voices in the darkness, movement in the jungle, the sound of equipment being moved and positions being prepared. Then dawn would come, and there would be nothing. No attack, no enemy contact, just the psychological residue of a night spent waiting for death that never arrived. You couldn't sleep, recalled Private Bobby Henderson, who survived Guadalcanal and went on to fight at Tarawa and Saipan. Not really. You'd close your eyes and hear them moving around out there, talking, laughing, getting ready to kill you. Sometimes you'd hear American voices too, and you'd think, is that Jimmy? Is that Rodriguez? But you couldn't go check because it might be a trap. So you just lay there and listened to your friends die, or thought you did, and went a little more crazy every night. The psychological pressure was constant and unrelenting. Every night brought new sounds, new threats, new reasons to stay awake with your rifle in your hands. Sleep became a luxury that few Marines could afford, leading to exhaustion that made every decision harder and every mistake more likely. During the day, the jungle was filled with snipers who could put a bullet through your head from 300 yards while remaining completely invisible. Japanese positions were so well camouflaged that Marines could walk within feet of occupied bunkers without realizing the enemy was there. Patrol duty became a game of deadly hide-and-seek where the stakes were your life and the lives of your friends. Food was another constant problem. Sea rations spoiled in the heat and humidity, and resupply ships couldn't always get through the Japanese naval blockade that surrounded the island. Marines learned to eat anything they could find, captured Japanese rice, tropical fruits that might or might not be edible, even insects when desperation became complete. Disease was as dangerous as enemy bullets. Malaria was epidemic, spread by mosquitoes that swarmed in clouds thick enough to darken the air. Dysentery turned strong Marines into weakened shadows of themselves. Tropical ulcers refused to heal in the constant humidity, becoming infected wounds that could incapacitate a man as effectively as any Japanese bullet. But perhaps worst of all was the knowledge that they were fighting for a place that most of them had never heard of before they arrived, for reasons that weren't entirely clear, against an enemy who seemed to prefer death to defeat. The strategic importance of Guadalcanal was obvious to the generals and admirals who'd ordered the operation, but to the Marines slogging through the jungle, it was just another patch of hostile ground that wanted to kill them. Henderson Field was the prize, an airstrip carved out of the jungle that could control the entire Solomon Islands chain. Whoever held it controlled the Pacific, or at least this crucial section of it. The Japanese had been building the airfield when the Marines landed, and they wanted it back with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The airfield itself was primitive, just a strip of crushed coral and rolled earth barely long enough for fighter planes to land and take off. But it represented something larger, the first major Japanese territory that American forces had captured, the first real victory in a war that had been nothing but defeat and retreat since Pearl Harbor. For the Marines defending it, Henderson Field was both lifeline and target. American planes could land there to resupply and support ground operations, but it also drew Japanese attacks like a magnet draws iron filings. Every night brought new assaults, new attempts to recapture the field and drive the Americans back into the sea. The perimeter around Henderson Field became the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific War. If it fell, the entire American position on Guadalcanal would become untenable. If it held, the Marines could continue to build up their forces and eventually secure the entire island. John Basilone and his machine gun crew had been positioned along the Lunga River, part of a thin defensive line that was all that stood between the Japanese and complete victory. The Marines called it that God-forsaken perimeter, and for good reason. If it broke, the war in the Pacific might have ended very differently. The river itself wasn't much, a sluggish stream maybe 30 feet wide, choked with vegetation and filled with the kind of stagnant water that bred disease and despair in equal measure. But it represented a natural obstacle that could channel Japanese attacks into predictable avenues, making the Marines' defensive fire more effective. The machine gun position itself was a hastily constructed affair of sandbags, coral, and prayer, positioned to cover the most likely avenue of Japanese approach across the Lunga River. It wasn't sophisticated, just a semicircular wall with firing ports and overhead cover made from palm logs and corrugated metal salvaged from destroyed buildings, but it was strategically crucial. The position controlled the main ford across the river, the route the Japanese would have to take if they wanted to assault Henderson Field directly. If Basilone's gun fell silent, the entire Marine defensive line would be compromised, and thousands of Marines would die in the resulting breakthrough. The crew consisted of Basilone as the gunner, George Jacobs as his assistant gunner, and 4 ammunition bearers whose job was to keep the gun fed during extended firefights. They'd worked together for months, developing the kind of wordless communication that comes from shared danger and mutual dependence. George Jacobs was a kid from Detroit, barely 21, with a quick smile and an endless supply of dirty jokes that kept morale up during the long, tense watches. He'd been a mechanic before the war, working in his father's garage and learning how to keep temperamental machines running under impossible conditions. More importantly, he understood the rhythm of combat, the ebb and flow of a firefight that told you when to shoot, when to move, when to duck. George could read a battle like some people read books. Basilone would write to his sister. He always knew what I needed before I asked for it. New belt of ammunition, barrel change, target identification, he was always one step ahead. In a machine gun crew, that kind of teamwork means the difference between life and death. George had joined the Marines for the same reason as most of his generation. Pearl Harbor had made it personal, and he wanted to be part of the fight that would avenge that sneak attack. But unlike many of his comrades, he'd found his calling in the technical aspects of warfare. He could field strip and reassemble a machine gun blindfolded, diagnose malfunctions by sound, and keep weapons functioning under conditions that would stop most people cold. More than technical skill, George brought a sense of humor that helped keep the crew sane during the long nights when they waited for attacks that might never come. He could find something funny in almost any situation, no matter how desperate or dangerous. His laugh was infectious, and his ability to deflate tension with a well-timed joke made him invaluable to unit morale. The other members of the crew were Jimmy Patterson, a corpsman from Ohio who'd volunteered for ammunition duty, Rodriguez, a quiet kid from New Mexico who could carry more weight than men twice his size, and Bobby Taylor, a farm boy from Iowa who treated military discipline like a natural extension of agricultural routine. Each man brought different skills and perspectives, but they'd been welded into a team by shared hardship and mutual dependence. They ate together, slept together, and faced death together on a daily basis. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, hopes and fears, the names of girlfriends back home and the contents of letters from worried parents. "We weren't just a crew," Jimmy Patterson would write to his sister. "We were family. The kind of family that's forged in combat, where you know that the guy next to you would die for you, and you do the same for him. It's a bond that civilians can't understand, because it's based on life and death in a way that nothing else ever is." The weeks before the major Japanese attack were filled with the kind of routine that characterizes military life everywhere: maintenance, training, patrol duty, and the endless waiting that consumes more time than actual combat. But on Guadalcanal, even routine was dangerous. Daily patrols into the jungle became exercises in survival, with every step potentially triggering an ambush or sniper attack. The Marines learned to move through the dense vegetation like shadows, communicating through hand signals and developing an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings. Maintenance became a constant battle against the tropical environment that seemed determined to destroy everything it touched. Weapons had to be cleaned multiple times daily to prevent rust and corrosion. Equipment had to be waterproofed and re-waterproofed as the constant humidity found its way into everything. Food and water were constant concerns. Sea rations might be spoiled before they were opened, and water purification tablets couldn't always eliminate the taste and smell of jungle streams filled with rotting vegetation and worse. Marines learned to eat anything that wouldn't immediately kill them and to be grateful for whatever they could get, but worse than the physical discomforts was the psychological pressure of knowing that death could come at any moment from any direction. Snipers were everywhere, invisible in the jungle canopy but deadly accurate when they chose to reveal themselves. Booby traps were scattered along every trail, designed to kill or maim Marines who made the mistake of stepping in the wrong place. Sleep became a luxury that few Marines could afford. Even during supposedly quiet periods, the jungle was filled with sounds that might mean approaching enemy soldiers or might just be wildlife. Learning to distinguish between the two was a skill that kept Marines alive, but it also meant that restful sleep was almost impossible. The Japanese psychological warfare campaign was constant and unnerving. They would call out Marines' names in the darkness, having learned them from captured documents or intercepted communications. They would imitate American accents, trying to draw Marines out of their positions with fake calls for help or medical assistance. "They knew everything about us," Private Taylor would write in his diary. "Our names, our hometowns, sometimes even the names of our girlfriends. They'd use that information to get inside our heads, to make us question everything, including whether the voices we heard in the dark were really our friends calling for help." The attack came on the night of October 24, 1942. After weeks of intelligence reports indicating that the Japanese were massing forces for a major assault. But intelligence reports were one thing, the reality of 3,000 screaming Japanese soldiers charging across the Lunga River was something else entirely. It began with artillery, not the usual random harassment fire that the Marines had grown accustomed to, but a carefully coordinated barrage that targeted every known American position simultaneously. The shells came in waves, walking back and forth across the perimeter with methodical precision designed to destroy defensive positions and demoralize defenders. Palm trees exploded into splinters that became deadly projectiles. Coral dust filled the air like snow, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The earth itself seemed to convulse under the impact of high explosive shells that could kill men hundreds of yards from where they landed. The bombardment lasted for 2 hours, the longest sustained artillery attack the Marines had experienced since landing on Guadalcanal. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost as deafening as the explosions had been. Marines huddled in their foxholes and bunkers, knowing that the artillery had been just the prelude to something much worse. Then came the banzai charges, waves of Japanese soldiers charging across the river, screaming, "Marines die! Marines, you die!" In heavily accented English, their bayonets glittering in the light of exploding shells and burning vegetation. They came in human waves, each one larger than the last, designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers. The first wave consisted of maybe 300 soldiers, moving in loose formation across the river ford that Basilone's machine gun had been positioned to cover. They appeared out of the jungle darkness like ghosts, barely visible until they were halfway across the water and committed to their attack. Basilone's machine gun opened up with a sound like tearing canvas, the muzzle flash strobing in the darkness as he fired controlled bursts into the mass of attacking infantry. The water around the ford began to churn with the impact of bullets and the thrashing of wounded men, but still they kept coming. The noise was indescribable, wrote Marine correspondent Robert Sherrod, who was present during the battle. The sound of hundreds of weapons firing at once, mixed with the screams of the wounded and dying, the crash of continuing artillery fire, and the inhuman shrieking of the Japanese battle cries. It was like being inside a thunderstorm made of metal and death. The Japanese soldiers fell in windrows, cut down by the sustained fire from Basilone's position and the supporting weapons scattered along the defensive line. But for every man who fell, two more took his place, charging forward over the bodies of their comrades with a fanaticism that American Marines found both terrifying and incomprehensible. But here's what the war bond speeches never mentioned: Basilone wasn't alone that night, and he wasn't some superhuman killing machine operating in isolation. He had a crew: George Jacobs, his assistant gunner, and the ammunition bearers whose names have been lost to history but whose sacrifice made everything else possible. They fed him ammo, cleared jams, spotted targets, and died one by one as the Japanese concentrated their fire on the machine gun nest that was destroying their attacks. The Japanese had quickly identified Basilone's position as the key to the Marine defense, and they directed everything they had at it. Mortar rounds bracketed the gun position, walking closer with each shot as Japanese spotters adjusted their aim. Rifle bullets chipped the coral fortifications, sending razor-sharp fragments spinning through the air like shrapnel. Grenades landed in the position with monotonous regularity, forcing the crew to dive for cover while the gun fell silent. Each time they took cover, the Japanese advanced a little farther across the river, gaining ground that would make the next attack even more dangerous. George took a bullet in the chest around midnight, Basilone would later write to his sister. He kept feeding me ammo for another 20 minutes before he bled out. Never said a word about it. Just kept doing his job. When I looked over and saw him slumped against the ammunition boxes, I knew I was on my own. But Basilone wasn't really alone. Throughout that long night, other Marines kept him supplied with ammunition, crawling through the mud and gunfire to deliver belt after belt of .30 caliber rounds. When his water-cooled barrel overheated from continuous firing, a corpsman named Jimmy Patterson belly crawled 50 yards under fire to deliver a replacement. Patterson never made it back to his own position. A Japanese sniper put a bullet through his head just as he was sliding back into the darkness, his body falling across the ammunition boxes so that Basilone had to push his friend's corpse aside every time he reached for a fresh belt of ammo. The personal cost of the battle was becoming clear even as it was being fought. These weren't just statistics or casualties, they were friends, men he'd trained with and lived with and shared the daily miseries of jungle warfare. Every face illuminated by muzzle flash was familiar, every death was personal, every loss was a piece of his own soul being torn away. The Japanese came in waves, each one larger and more desperate than the last. They charged across the river, through the swamp, around the flanks, trying to find some weak point in the Marine defenses that would allow them to break through to Henderson Field. Basilone's machine gun cut them down by the dozens, the barrel glowing cherry red in the darkness, but for every Japanese soldier who fell, two more took his place. The math was simple and terrible: they would eventually overrun his position through sheer numbers unless something extraordinary happened. The Japanese had committed their entire reserve to this attack, and they were willing to spend every minute if necessary to recapture Henderson Field around 2 in the morning, with his primary gun position about to be overrun and his crew either dead or wounded. Basilone made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of falling back or calling for reinforcement that wasn't coming, he gathered every spare part and ammunition belt he could carry and began moving through the battlefield, repairing and repositioning abandoned machine gun positions. The no man's land between the Marine and Japanese lines had become a charnel house of mud, blood, and body parts. Shell craters filled with stagnant water that reflected the muzzle flashes like broken mirrors. Trees stripped of their bark and leaves stood like skeletal sentinels over a landscape that no longer resembled anything natural or sane. Basilone crawled through this hell with Japanese soldiers literally stepping over him, their attention focused on the Marine positions ahead while he worked to establish new firing positions behind their advancing troops. Several times, he had to lie motionless under Japanese corpses while enemy patrols passed within arm's reach, close enough that he could smell their sweat and hear their whispered conversations. When he reached the first abandoned gun position, he found it partially destroyed by mortar fire, the gun itself twisted and inoperable but the tripod still intact and several hundred rounds of ammunition scattered around the position. Working by feel in the darkness, with Japanese soldiers advancing past his position toward the Marine lines, Basilone mounted his spare barrel and began setting up a second firing position. The Japanese had bypassed this position, assuming it was out of action and no longer a threat to their advance. When Basilone's gun suddenly roared to life behind their attacking troops, it created chaos in their ranks that no amount of training or discipline could have prepared them for. Soldiers who had been charging toward the Marine lines suddenly found themselves taking fire from their own rear, caught in a crossfire that decimated their formation and destroyed the careful coordination of their attack. Units that had been advancing in good order suddenly scattered, trying to deal with threats from multiple directions simultaneously. But even as he was saving Henderson Field, Basilone was watching his friends die around him in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Every muzzle flash revealed new horrors: Marines cut down by artillery that fell short, Japanese soldiers bayoneting wounded Americans who couldn't defend themselves, the systematic destruction of everything he'd come to value about military brotherhood and honor. "I kept firing until the barrel glowed white-hot," he'd tell the psychiatrist years later, during one of his mandatory evaluations. "The Japanese bodies were piled so high in front of my position that I had to adjust my aim over them to hit the ones still advancing. But all I could think about was George, bleeding out next to me, still trying to help. Still trying to do his job even while he was dying." The fighting continued until dawn, wave after wave of Japanese attacks breaking against the Marine defensive line like ocean swells against a seawall. By the time the sun rose over Guadalcanal, the Lunga River was choked with bodies, and the jungle was silent except for the moans of the wounded and dying from both sides. When the final Japanese attack was repulsed, Basilone found himself still at his machine gun, still scanning the tree line for targets that would never come. He'd been firing almost continuously for 8 hours, and his hands were cramped into claws around the weapon's grips. A Navy corpsman had to pry his fingers loose from the gun. Henderson Field remained in American hands, but the victory had come at a cost that would haunt John Basilone for the rest of his life. When the body count was completed, 38 Japanese soldiers were found dead in front of his primary gun position, with dozens more scattered around the secondary positions he'd established during the night. The Marine casualties in his sector were equally devastating: George Jacobs, Jimmy Patterson, Rodriguez, Bobby Taylor, and 6 others who died keeping him supplied with ammunition and spare parts. The machine gun crew that had been his military family was gone, replaced by neat rows of bodies covered with ponchos while graves registration teams prepared them for burial. The morning after the battle, Basilone sat among the corpses of his friends, still holding his machine gun, still scanning the tree line for targets that would never materialize. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight, firing almost continuously for 8 of those hours, and his hands were cramped around the gun's grips like they'd been welded there. He was in shock, recalled Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller, who commanded the Marine Battalion and would later become a legend in his own right. Not medical shock, psychological shock. He kept asking about his crew, wanting to know if they were okay, if they needed medical attention, if there was anything he could do to help them. He couldn't accept that they were dead. The shock wasn't just from the intensity of the combat, it was from the realization that he'd survived when better men hadn't. George Jacobs, who could diagnose mechanical problems by sound and whose laugh had kept morale up during the worst times. Jimmy Patterson, who'd risked his life to keep the gun supplied and had died doing his duty. All of them were gone, and John Basilone was still breathing. The brass descended on Guadalcanal like vultures on roadkill, looking for heroes to pin medals on and stories to tell the folks back home who needed something to believe in after months of defeat and retreat. Basilone fit the bill perfectly, a tough Italian kid from New Jersey who'd held the line when it mattered most, whose actions had quite possibly saved Henderson Field and changed the course of the Pacific War. They pulled him off the island before he could object, before he could request transfer to another unit or ask to stay with the Marines who were still fighting and dying in the jungle. One day he was a machine gunner in a defensive position, the next day he was on a transport ship bound for Australia, stuffed into a clean uniform and told to prepare for a different kind of service. The Medal of Honor ceremony was held at the White House in May 1943, with all the pomp and circumstance the military could muster. President Roosevelt himself hung the medal around Basilone's neck and shook his hand for the photographers, while reporters scribbled notes about the hero from New Jersey who'd single-handedly stopped a Japanese banzai charge. "The American people owe you a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid," the president said, his famous smile beaming for the cameras that would carry the image to newspapers across the country. "Your actions on Guadalcanal represent the finest traditions of American heroism and devotion to duty." But Basilone barely heard the words. In his mind, he was still on Guadalcanal, still listening to George's labored breathing as he bled out against the ammunition boxes, still smelling the cordite and death that had soaked into his uniform like a perfume he couldn't wash out. "I don't deserve this," he whispered to the president, so quietly that only Roosevelt could hear above the clicking of cameras and the applause of the assembled dignitaries. The president's smile faltered for just a moment, and his eyes showed a flicker of the understanding that comes from having sent thousands of young men to their deaths in the name of necessary wars. "Son," he said, his voice equally quiet, "heroism isn't about what we deserve. It's about what we do when everything else fails, and everyone else is counting on us to succeed." The war bond tour was supposed to be easy duty, travel around the country, give speeches, sell bonds, kiss babies, and bask in the adulation of a grateful nation that needed heroes more than it needed honest accounts of what war was really like. For most servicemen, it would have been a dream assignment, a chance to see America and be treated like celebrities while other men fought and died in foreign jungles. For Basilone, it was a different kind of hell, one that was harder to endure than combat because it required him to lie about the most important experience of his life. The tour began in Washington, D.C., where Basilone was introduced to the machinery of American propaganda. There were publicity photos to be taken, Basilone in dress uniform, Basilone with his Medal of Honor, Basilone shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. There were interviews to be given to reporters who wanted human interest stories about the hero's hometown, his family, his plans for after the war. Most difficult of all, there were speeches to be written by professional writers who'd never seen combat, never held a dying friend in their arms, never had to choose between personal survival and duty to their unit. The speeches were full of noble sentiments about duty and honor and the American way of life, but they bore no resemblance to the reality of what had happened on Guadalcanal. "They wanted me to be a symbol," Basilone would later write to his sister Anna. Not a person, not a Marine with friends who died, but a symbol of everything America was supposed to represent. Clean, noble, heroic, uncomplicated. They didn't want to hear about George or Jimmy or any of the others. They just wanted the story they'd already written in their heads. The speeches painted him as a superhuman warrior who'd single-handedly defeated hundreds of Japanese soldiers through superior American training and fighting spirit. They emphasized his kill count, 38 confirmed enemy dead, while ignoring the cost in American lives that had made his actions possible. Worst of all, they portrayed the battle as a glorious victory, a triumph of good over evil that proved American superiority and inevitable victory in the Pacific. They never mentioned the friends who died, the randomness of who lived and who didn't, the way that survival often depended more on luck than skill or courage. Every night was a new city, a new auditorium, a new crowd of people who wanted to touch the hero, to hear about his exploits, to feel connected to the war through his story. But they didn't want the real story. They wanted the sanitized version, the one where good triumphs over evil and heroes come home to parades and ticker tape celebrations. In Chicago, he spoke to 5,000 people packed into the Civic Opera House, the same venue where Enrico Caruso had once performed and where the city's elite came to see and be seen. The applause was thunderous when he was introduced, a wave of sound that seemed to physically push him backward as he approached the microphone. The audience was dressed in their finest clothes, men in expensive suits, women in evening gowns and jewelry that caught the stage lights. They'd paid substantial sums for war bonds in exchange for the privilege of hearing from a genuine hero, and they expected to get their money's worth in inspiration and patriotic sentiment. But as he stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of expectant faces, all he could see were the faces of the dead. George Jacobs, slumped against the ammunition boxes with blood on his lips. Jimmy Patterson, reaching for a fresh belt of ammunition even as the life was leaving his eyes. Rodriguez, who'd carried more weight than men twice his size and had never complained about anything. "I'm supposed to tell you about heroism," he began, deviating from his prepared script for the first time since the tour had started. "But the real heroes aren't here tonight. They're still out there, in places you can't pronounce, doing jobs you wouldn't believe. And some of them are never coming home." The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't what they'd paid to hear. They wanted stories of American triumph, not reminders of American sacrifice. In Detroit, he visited the Willow Run plant where Ford was producing B-24 bombers around the clock, a massive facility that had been converted from automobile production to aircraft manufacturing in a matter of months. The workers cheered when he arrived, proud to meet the famous hero, eager to hear how their products were helping win the war. But all Basilone could think about as he toured the production line was how those bombers would carry Marines to new beaches where more George Jacobses would die, more Jimmy Pattersons would crawl through enemy fire to deliver ammunition to positions that might not hold. Every rivet, every sheet of aluminum, every engine represented future casualties in wars that hadn't been fought yet. "Keep up the good work," he told the assembled workers, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "The boys overseas are counting on you." But what he wanted to say was that the boys overseas were dying, that their lives were being spent like coins to purchase objectives that most of them had never heard of before they'd been ordered to capture them. In Philadelphia, a group of schoolchildren had prepared a pageant about his exploits on Guadalcanal, complete with cardboard machine guns and paper uniforms. They'd researched the battle as best they could from newspaper accounts and had created a theatrical version that bore only passing resemblance to reality. The teacher beamed with pride as 8-year-olds pretended to mow down attacking Japanese soldiers, their toy guns chattering with sound effects provided by their own voices. They'd turned the most traumatic experience of his life into a children's game, complete with good guys and bad guys and a happy ending where the hero survived and the enemies were all defeated. Basilone watched the performance in silence, his hands clenched so tightly in his lap that his fingernails drew blood from his palms. When it was over and the children looked at him expectantly for approval, he managed to smile and tell them they'd done a wonderful job, but inside he was screaming. In San Francisco, he met a woman whose son had been killed at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. She thanked him for avenging her boy, tears streaming down her face as she pressed a photograph into his hands. The boy in the picture looked exactly like George Jacobs, young, optimistic, ready to serve his country in whatever capacity was required. "My Billy was on the Arizona when it went down," she whispered. "He was only 19. I want you to know that when I hear about what you did on Guadalcanal, it helps me sleep at night knowing that you made those Japanese pay for what they did to my boy." Basilone stared at the photograph, seeing George's face reflected in the young sailor's smile. "Ma'am," he said finally, "your son died serving his country. That's what matters. That's what he'll be remembered for." But what he wanted to say was that her son had died because politicians had failed to prevent a war that everyone could see coming, that revenge was a poor substitute for bringing back the dead, that making the Japanese pay wouldn't fill the hole in her heart any more than surviving Guadalcanal had filled the hole in his. In Boston, he was presented with a key to the city by Mayor Maurice Tobin, who made a lengthy speech about how Basilone represented the best of American manhood and the finest traditions of military service. The crowd cheered, but all Basilone could think about was how American manhood had failed to keep George alive, how military traditions were meaningless when your friends were bleeding to death and there was nothing you could do to save them. The key itself was purely ceremonial, a large brass affair that would unlock no doors and open no passages to anywhere he wanted to go. It sat heavy in his hands like a weight that anchored him to a reality he no longer wanted to be part of, a world where symbols mattered more than substance and where the living were expected to carry the burden of representing the dead. In New York, he was invited to throw out the first pitch at Yankee Stadium, where 50,000 fans rose to their feet and applauded as he walked to the mound. The baseball felt foreign in his hands, too light, too clean, too removed from the tools of war that had become extensions of his body. The crowd expected a perfect pitch, a symbol of American precision and skill that would complement the story they'd been told about his military exploits. But his hands, still bearing the calluses and scars from weeks of firing a machine gun under combat conditions, couldn't quite manage the delicate touch that baseball required. The pitch sailed wide of home plate, and the crowd cheered anyway, because heroes weren't allowed to fail at anything, even ceremonial gestures. But it was in Newark, New Jersey, not far from his hometown, that everything finally fell apart in a way that would end his Warband tour and change the direction of his life. The venue was the Mosque Theater, a grand old building that had hosted everyone from Houdini to the Metropolitan Opera. The audience was particularly enthusiastic because Basilone was a local boy made good, a son of New Jersey who'd brought honor to his home state and his Italian-American community. He was halfway through his usual speech about duty and honor when he looked out at the audience and saw a woman in the front row crying. She was holding a telegram, the kind that started with, "We regret to inform you," and her whole body was shaking with a grief so profound that it seemed to fill the entire theater. Basilone stopped mid-sentence. The auditorium fell silent. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the woman and seeing his own mother's face, his own family's potential grief, the collective anguish of a nation that had sent its sons to die in places most people couldn't find on a map. Then he did something that would end his Warband tour forever and set him on the path that would lead to his death on a beach in the Pacific. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound system. "I'm sorry for your loss." The woman looked up, tears streaming down her face, and for a moment the entire theater held its breath. "My boy died at Guadalcanal," she whispered, her voice carrying in the silence. "They told me you were there. They said you might have known him." Basilone left the podium and walked down into the audience, ignoring the security personnel who tried to intercept him and the event organizers who were frantically signaling him to return to his script. He knelt beside the woman and took her hands in his, and 2,000 people watched in complete silence as the hero consoled the grieving mother. "What was his name?" he asked. "Tommy," she said. "Tommy Morrison. He was 19. He wanted to be a teacher when the war was over. He was going to marry his high school sweetheart and build a house with his own hands." Basilone closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back on Guadalcanal, back in the jungle hell where Tommy Morrison had died carrying ammunition to his position. The skinny kid from Pennsylvania who'd talked constantly about his girlfriend back home, about the school where he wanted to teach, about the life he was going to build when the war was over. Tommy had been killed by a Japanese grenade during the second night of fighting, torn apart by shrapnel while he was crawling through enemy fire to deliver the ammunition that had kept Basilone's gun firing for another crucial hour. He'd made it 30 yards from the ammunition dump before the explosion that had ended his dreams and his life simultaneously. "He was brave," Basilone said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "He was trying to help us. He died doing his job, trying to save his friends. He talked about you all the time, ma'am. About home, about the life he wanted to build. He died fighting for that life, for the right to come home and build it." The woman collapsed against him, sobbing with the kind of grief that comes from the deepest places in the human heart. Basilone held her while 2,000 people watched, and in that moment, something inside him broke wide open like a dam that had been holding back an ocean of guilt and grief and rage. He couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't sell the sanitized version of war to people who'd lost their children to it. He couldn't pretend that their sacrifice was glorious when he knew it was just necessary, just the price that had to be paid to stop men who would enslave the world if they weren't stopped. He couldn't stand on stages and accept applause for surviving when better men than him were still dying. Most of all, he couldn't come home alive when George and Jimmy and Tommy Morrison never would, when their mothers would never hold them again, when their dreams would never be realized and their lives would never be lived. The next morning, Basilone walked into his commanding officer's office in Philadelphia and requested immediate transfer back to combat duty. The request was denied, of course, and it would be denied many more times before it was finally approved. The Marine Corps wasn't about to risk their poster boy getting killed in some nameless jungle when he was worth more to the war effort alive than dead, but John Basilone was nothing if not persistent, and he'd finally found something more important than following orders: the need to balance scales that had been tipped the night he survived when better men didn't, the need to pay debts that could only be settled with blood. The war would continue for 2 more years, and John Basilone would spend most of that time fighting a different kind of battle, a bureaucratic war against military officials who wanted to keep him safe, against politicians who needed him as a symbol, against a country that preferred its heroes alive and available for public appearances. But in the end, he would win that war too, and it would cost him everything he had left to give, because some men are born to hold the line, to pay the price, to ensure that others can go home to their families and their futures and their dreams. John Basilone was one of those men, and he'd known it since the night he held Tommy Morrison's mother in his arms and realized that survival without purpose was just another form of death. The only question was how long it would take him to find his way back to the place where he belonged, back to the brotherhood of men who died while he lived, back to the debt that could only be paid in full on a beach where heroes go to die.